Hello and welcome to Legal Connections. I'm attorney and host Kimbra Major Morris. In our country, the Constitution provides certain rights to each citizen. And today we're going to dig deeper into some of those rights and the legal terminology used. Let's welcome Professor Leroy Purnell from the FAMU College of Law. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you this morning?
I'm doing fine.
Good. Welcome, and tell us a little bit about the Miranda Rights and what does due process mean? Because all these legal terms flying around. So you're the professor.
Well, that's a big slate. Let's start with Miranda. Miranda v. Arizona was decided by the United States Supreme Court. And essentially, it responded to the concern about what happens during interrogations between individuals and police when there's no one there but the officers and that individual. And so what Miranda does is say that in order to protect an individual's right to remain silent, which we do have under the Constitution, that the individual needs to be informed of their right to remain silent. And their right to have counsel present before answering any questions. So once there is what's known as custodial interrogation, that is, once you are in custody, before questioning can begin, the police are obligated to inform you of those rights. Now that's part one. Part two is that you have to then make a decision, either through words or actions, as to whether or not you're going to waive those rights and answer questions. And a lot of people don't understand and appreciate that sometimes what you do can be a waiver of those rights as well as what you say. So in order for the rights to be properly waived, it has to be voluntary, and it should be a knowing waiver of your rights. You have essentially two sets of rights there that in terms of waiver, the courts are most concerned about in a Miranda situation. One is your right to remain silent. So once you indicate that you do wish to remain silent, the police cannot interrogate you again, or at least have to give a respect to your choice to remain silent. They can't immediately start questioning you again. They can come back later on and see whether or not you still wish to remain silent. The other set of rights that's very important in a Miranda situation is that right to counsel. And once you indicate that I wish to have an attorney present, all interrogation must stop at that point and cannot continue again unless you waive those rights and decide that you are going to talk with the police. Now, there needs to be a record usually kept that you've been informed of those rights, and there should be some indication that you made a knowing waiver of those rights.
Well, that's interesting. So I'm thinking so many things going through my mind about how these situations, I'm sure, are a lot of times just so exciting in the way that there's a lot going on. And so when you say there needs to be a record kept, when we think about groups of officers showing up at a scene, some of that, that makes sense, that someone would have to be the person observing and taking a record, and then we have the body cameras now recording these things. But I would imagine that it's not always clear when someone is giving consent.
No, it's not always clear, and one of the things I think has to always be remembered: an interrogation situation is inherently coercive, and that's not necessarily a product of intent. It's the situation. You are usually being held in some place where you don't have, by definition, you're not free to leave. You're surrounded by law enforcement officers who are trained how to interrogate you and get you to talk. So the pressure's there. You're worried about what's going to happen to you. You're worried about contacting your family. And the courts were sensitive to that when Miranda was decided. And that's what I said, as a kind of protection against that coercive environment, you needed to know these rights, and people do need to understand these rights. There is a tremendous pressure on people to talk. They feel it internally, the police are very well trained on how to get you to talk and make statements that are against your own interests, and you don't even know you're doing it.
Right.
I try to tell people all the time, you are no match as an individual person against a trained police officer interrogator. They know their stuff. They've been trained to do their stuff. And despite what you might think, you usually cannot talk your way out of trouble.
That's it. That's it. Well, there were so many questions that I have, and I know we don't have enough time, but in 30 seconds or less, can you give us a definition of due process?
Oh. Well, 30 seconds or less, due process. Due process from a constitutional point of view, first of all, is a restriction first on the federal government and then on the state, that actions that they take cannot violate the basic protections that you have under due process. Due process, we usually talk about it in two forms. One, we have what's known as substantive due process. That is the power of government to do certain things. Governments have limits, and in terms of taking away individual liberties, individual rights, there are some limits that government can't go past without violating due process. They can't take your property without due process, for example. The other form of due process is what we call procedural due process. And what procedural due process says is that even if the government has a right to take an action, there has to be an opportunity for you to voice your objection, to have a neutral and detached body hear your objection, and to have fair notice that an attempt is being made to take your rights away.
Okay. I always feel so much smarter when I talk to you, Professor. Thank you so much for taking a little time out of your day to educate us on these very important things. We are always seeing them in the headlines, and it's always good to have someone like you to come and break things down for us. So thank you.
My pleasure. Anytime.
That was a great overview of some of the common legal terms and phrases. Hopefully you were able to take notes and now have a better understanding of the law. Stay tuned for more Legal Connections.